All right, in this video, we're going to be talking about the context of Petrarchan sonnets, and it's about time. I've been talking a lot about Petrarchan sonnets, but it's only in this video where I get to talk about what that term even means, what we're even talking about when we say Petrarchan sonnets. All right, so let's start at the beginning here. It all starts with this figure named Petrarch, who is an Italian poet in 14th century Italy. Now, for reference, we want to acknowledge that this is around the time that Chaucer is writing in the 14th century in England. So if we're talking about 16th century poems being Petrarchan, that's 2 centuries later. Nevertheless, the originator of this style of poetry is this guy, Francesco Petrarca, who is a poet, again, in 14th century Italy. And his poems are inspired by this figure of Laura, who is a person that he sees from afar one day and immediately becomes infatuated with, enamored with, in love with, and begins to write poems about her. We are not even sure if Petrarch met Laura or even knew her personally, because all of his poems focus on how this love is unrequited. Laura is not interested in Petrarch. She has no desire to know him, to love him, but he is trapped in this experience of love for her that he cannot escape. So his poems really focus on the pleasures and pain of love, but unrequited love in particular. And that's something we'll talk about a little bit more in the themes video. Now, in addition to this 14th century Italian poet, what does this have to do with 16th century England? Well, it's in the 16th century that Thomas Wyatt begins to translate Petrarch's poems into English. And by doing so, everyone gets really interested in Petrarch's poetry. So a lot of people start translating his poems. Then they start writing their own Petrarchan sonnets inspired by these conventions of a male speaker whose love is unrequited from a female beloved. Other things also happen in England during this time. The printing press, as we talked about in an earlier video, comes to England in the late 15th century. And in the early 16th century, the Protestant Reformation happens in Europe, which to put it very shortly or concisely, the medieval Christian church has a schism in the early 16th century. There's this group of protesters who call themselves Protestants. You can see that word protest in Protestant. And they take issue with a lot of things that the medieval Christian church has been doing. And there is no reconciliation, so these Protestants decide to separate from the church. And the medieval church decides to call itself the Catholic Church all of a sudden, because Catholic means universal. And they're saying, oh, we're the true universal church. And the Protestants are saying, no, you're corrupt. We're the true universal church. Now, all throughout Europe, countries, people are having to decide which church to side with. You know, the medieval Christian church that's now called Catholic, or the new Protestant church. And this results in all kinds of violence and warfare throughout Europe. And this violence and warfare makes it to England as well. So in the first half of the 16th century, different kings and queens of England were either Protestant or Catholic, and if they were one or the other, they tended to persecute the opposite. So Henry VIII and his son Edward VI were Protestant, and they would persecute and even execute Catholics. Later, Mary I comes to the throne, and she's Catholic, and so she begins to persecute and execute Protestants. So there's a lot of people dying from this tension stemmed from the Protestant Reformation. And it's only when Queen Elizabeth comes to the throne that she just tries to stop the violence and to establish what she calls a via media, or a middle way that will be more tolerant and peaceful. I don't think by our 21st century standards we would find this very tolerant, because her deal is that Catholics, they can't go to university, they have to pay a special tax, and they cannot work for the government. But she's not killing them. And in comparison to the previous rulers of England, that does seem like a big step forward. So she sees it as a good, tolerant middle ground. And it did prevent a lot more violence. I also, now that we're jumping ahead in time, like to give a bit of attention to the fashion trends. In the era of Henry VIII, It seems to me like fur was having like a real moment. We see a lot of the similar kind of leg reveal that we saw in 14th century England, but now everyone's kind of adorned by these fur jackets. And the same is true for women who have fur shawls around their shoulders and arms. And if we move ahead to Elizabeth's reign, I think the distinctive item here is the ruff. We see the men wearing this kind of fabulous kind of neck piece, and women are doing the same. So the ruff seems to be key to fashion trends in this period. All right, that's all I've got for context this week. I'll see you in the themes video.